Hello, you're very welcome to the second of this special series of Aware's webinars, Coping with Depression. We're just waiting a few moments for everyone to get in. So while we're doing that, I've been asked to do the relaxation exercises again. So it's literally just noticing where you are right now, noticing how rushed or busy you were a few moments ago, and just noticing that you're here. You've got here, you've got in. You can hear us, hopefully you can see us. And just noticing your breath coming into your body and your breath leaving your body. Just noticing again your breath coming into your body. Maybe holding your breath, 2, 3, and then breathing out, noticing your breath leaving your body. And now this time, breathing in space, breathing out space, breathing in rest, breathing out rest, breathing in relaxation, breathing out relaxation. So some of you might not be feeling relaxed right now. You might be feeling impatient, saying, Claire, look, that's enough of that. Let's get on with it. So we'll get on with it. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Keith Gaynor. Keith is a senior clinical psychologist. I'm also privileged to call him my friend, and he's been involved with Aware for years. And we're going to have a conversation on coping with depression. We've got some questions already in from Monday, and those of you who joined us on Monday will know we were focusing on back to basics. What is depression? How can you recognize it in yourself, and how can you recognize it in someone else? So for those of you who missed Monday, I'd really encourage you to watch it, and then of course to tune in on Friday as well, because at this time on Friday we will be looking at personal perspectives, and we'll be talking to Brianna and to David, who are really amazing, I can't think of a better word, open in talking about their own experiences of depression and how they cope with it. So Keith, I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. Thank you so much. And kicking off, we're going to be focusing on coping with depression, but we have some questions from earlier in the week, from Monday, about what actually is depression. How can you differentiate it between stress and anxiety? So maybe if I ask you that question first, and then that'll get us to how do we cope with it.
Yeah. So I'd first like to thank you, Claire. People mightn't be aware that we started a few minutes late, and that was because I was stressed and I was anxious, and my laptop wasn't linking to the camera, and the camera wasn't linking to the Wi-Fi, and everything was going wrong. And so I think it's stress and anxiety is a good place to start. And stress, anxiety, and depression often go together. They're often there at the same time. So people who are depressed often feel anxious, and people who are anxious often also feel depressed. And part of the difference is anxiety lifts us up. Our heart rate goes up. We might feel sick in our stomach. We have an added level of energy. And we might be worried about something. We need to fix something. We want to get through something. That there's the added piece. And depression takes something away. It lowers our energy. We have less of an ability to do the things we want to do. We're less able to engage with people or engage with the life that we want to have. And often the two things can happen at the same time. So as we're less able to do something, we then get worried about it, and we think about it, and our heart gets pumped about it because we're not able to live the life that we want to live. And so often people who are depressed will also talk about being anxious and stressed. And equally, if we've been stressed and anxious for a long period of time, I talked to somebody last week about COVID and resilience. She said, how long do they want us to be resilient for? I've been resilient for 2 years now. How long am I meant to be resilient for? And so we keep being stressed, then actually we can get low and we can get demotivated, and our energy can go, and we can have pushed so long that we're no longer able to push. And so those feelings of low mood, low energy, low motivation, negative thinking are often the signs of depression. Those signs of increased energy, increased heart rate, sick feelings in our body, and a kind of rapid thinking are often the kind of signs of anxiety.
That makes so much sense, Keith. And I remember as well, and we were talking about this on Monday, that depression, the signs can be constant over a 2 week period, because any of us can feel down for, something happens and we feel upset. And anxiety can be more immediate. So we might, for instance, teenagers might worry about going into an exam, they'd feel anxious, and that adrenaline can be really important to help them, or artists going on stage. Or like me, some people might worry about afterwards. They might start thinking, I should have said this, or why did I say that? And then they might feel anxious. But it tends to be short-lived. It might come very often, but short-lived. Whereas depression can be just constant over a period. And we really encourage people who are experiencing the symptoms of depression. And we talked about festival, and I'd encourage people to look back on Monday. But if they're experiencing those for 2 weeks or more, it's really important to follow up with the GP. And that brings us to, how do we cope with depression? And we've got some really good questions, and I've sent them on to Keith. And one is about medication. And neither of us are medical practitioners and medical doctors. So I give you how do you respond when somebody asks you about antidepressants?
So I think antidepressants can be life-saving. I've seen people whose whole lives have turned around because they've started antidepressants, and they'll both be people I would have met professionally and people among my friends and family. And I also think that often the best way to think about them is as a foundation. It puts a stability for somebody that then allows them to go and do the things that they want to do with their life. It then allows them to go and do the work that they might want to do psychologically, or to engage socially in the way they want to do. But it allows them to then go and take the steps that they want to take. And so I'm not a medical practitioner. I can't give specific advice about antidepressants. They can be very useful when people feel anxious and feel depressed. But then there's often an important part, which is the psychological part of it. How am I thinking? Why am I thinking like this? And how do I stop thinking like this?
Yeah. I agree with you. I have found in the past that people, if their energy is very, very low, it can be, they just can find it so difficult to do what we know can help, like go for a walk, for instance. And they're saying, but I don't have the energy, whereas the antidepressants can give them that lift. But some of the questions, some of the people actually refer to the other side of it, that they've become, I don't want to use the word dependent, but used to antidepressants, and that is very much a part of their life. And there can be a fear of coming off antidepressants. And obviously that's done with a medical practitioner's support and advice. But there can be a fear of, well, if they've only relied on antidepressants to help them feel better, then what do they do? So this is where your tools, my tools, our skills come in. So if you'd like to talk about that, Keith, what, as well as medication, or instead of medication, depending on where people are at, what else can someone do to help if they're experiencing depression?
Well, I think it's worth starting with the idea that we have noisy brains, that we have all of this noise going on in our minds all the time. And we don't need a pandemic for our brains to be noisy, that often they've been happening all the way.
Your brain is noisy right now.
My brain is noisy.
It is. I can see that. You're thinking something else. So I'm going to be the person. So what are you thinking?
It's a metaphor for everything we're talking about. I got all of these messages popping up. Do you want to leave the webinar?
Oh my goodness. Okay. No, I don't want you to leave. But that's a brilliant example, Keith, of how, when you were telling me what you were telling me, I knew you were thinking something else, because I could see that you were feeling a little bit, well, distracted, and you might have been feeling a little bit under pressure, but I could see it in your eyes. So that's a great real life example. And then how you coped with that was you just were very upfront, and you said, well, yeah, look, there's other things going on here. So you didn't hide it, you didn't pretend. But anyway,
but I think this is it, that we can often try and pretend that everything is okay. We believe that everyone else's mind is clear and everything is easy and everything is simple, when actually no, our brains are noisy. They're telling us, you are terrible at that, you should have done something different, why didn't you do something better? It's often called the tyranny of the shoulds. We get self-critical, we get worried, we want things to be better, but we don't know how to get there, and we often blame ourselves as we're the fault for it not being in some other way. And so one of the things that we often sort of teach through psychology is to be able to notice those thoughts and to step away from them and to notice, okay, there's all this noise going on and I'm not going to engage with it. I'm going to allow it to pass me. And people have all sorts of metaphors and images for that. But it's like a fly fisherman standing in the river, and the river is flowing past him. And he doesn't have to cast the rod out at every single leaf that passes. You just let it pass. And said, look, my brain gets noisy, and sometimes it gets self-critical, and sometimes it gets worried, and it doesn't want to let people down, or it doesn't want to, mess up a webinar or whatever. And I'm just going to let those thoughts pass. And in a few minutes, they will pass, and I'll be able to move on with what I want to do, not what my noisy brain wants me to do.
I love your how you describe that, and I just really enjoying this conversation because you're giving me so many different ideas in terms of adding to my repertoire and how I work. And I remember somebody saying to me at one point, we're having a conversation here, but if 20 people come in behind you and they started to shout, or 3 people, and they called you useless, they called you pathetic, they said, what are you doing? It would be very difficult for us to concentrate on the conversation. So with those noisy thoughts, it really can impact on us being able to carry out our normal activities.
And then often we do things that would look like depressed behavior. We pull back, we talk less, we engage less. We say, actually, will I go and meet Claire for a coffee, or will I stay at home and, and stay in my house? And it seems more comfortable to stay in our house at that moment because it's so difficult when we're out in those situations. And so our life gets a little bit smaller, and then we lose out something. We lose maybe a little bit of social connection, or we lose a bit of friendship that actually would help us in those moments.
So what you're describing, people often ask me, what is CBT? So C is cognitive, which is word for thoughts. B is behavior. So what you've been describing, Keith, is you've been talking about the noisy thoughts, and then you moved on to behavior in terms of how we react if we're feeling down, if we're feeling anxious, if we're feeling upset. Are there any other activities that you think that we can do to help? Well, first of all, really to understand depression. So what you just said, we withdraw. So how can we help ourselves then cope with depression?
So I think that the first bit is noticing that their thoughts aren't necessarily a fact. The thoughts are telling us that we're an awful person, that we should have done these 10 other things, that we should have done it all better. But it doesn't mean it's true. And that actually we can treat ourselves with a little bit of kindness, and we can talk to ourselves with a little bit of kindness. And that actually I'm a normal person doing my best on a normal day. And I'm no better and worse than everyone else who's out there. And we can just start noticing that these terrible thoughts aren't reality. They're just terrible thoughts that are in our mind sometimes. And if I'm just a normal person doing my best, well, then maybe I can meet Claire for a coffee. And maybe she'll understand that I'm not, full of jokes, and maybe I'm not, I'm not the best that I've ever been, but she'll understand that because she's my friend. And so I can take that one small step. I can go for the walk. I can meet the friend for the coffee. I can walk to the end of the garden. I could send a single text, but I could do one small positive behavior that might move in the opposite direction to where the depression is telling me to go.
And you just used one of my favorite words, maybe. And people who, if we were to say to someone, you're a normal person, but they don't believe that, and they might say, no, I'm not, and they can get caught into all of the reasons why they're not. So I love the word maybe. So for someone who's resisting what you've just said, Keith, and is going, I'm not a normal person, he's talking about everybody else, to use the word maybe there. So maybe I am a normal person. Gosh, what would that be like? And not fighting with the I am and I'm not, just maybe allowing that word to seep in.
And it allows us just to hold that idea. And if I was a normal person, but I did have these awful thoughts, that's a really difficult place for me to be. A little bit of compassion for myself in that situation. God, how tough it is for me to have thousands and thousands of thoughts every day telling me I'm an awful person, when actually maybe I'm a normal person who's doing my best.
And that fits in with Dr. Aaron Beck uses the Beck Depression Inventory. You're very familiar with the BDI. But one of the questions, there's 21 sections in that where people can check how they've been over the last 2 weeks. But the question 8 is the one I always pay really strong attention to. I think it's like dominoes lined up, and then question 8 just clicks and then brings the rest of them down. And it's about this self-criticalness. How hard are we on ourselves? And my experience, myself and people I care about and people I know, when we're not feeling great, we can be even more self-critical, and that so it can be hard to be self-compassionate. And I love how you've just described it.
And so if we can bring a little bit of that self-compassion to ourselves, then we can maybe make a small step. At the end of the small step, we have a choice. We can be really self-critical again. And it says, oh, well, I didn't do the 10-kilometer walk. I didn't go as far as I could. I didn't go to the gym. Or we can bring a little bit of kindness again. I did do this. On a really tough day when I was feeling like doing nothing, I did do this one thing. And well done me. Okay, I did well today.
And you know, the fear of making a mistake and making a mistake publicly, well, you're a great example of, you know, you were a little bit slightly all over the place initially, not massively, but slightly. And you dealt with it, you know, and, you know, you're still Keith Gaynor, Dr. Keith Gaynor, you're still your person, you still have your profession. So what? What was the worst that could have happened? Well, you know, we could have had people giving out to us because we're a minute or two late. And then maybe that was an opportunity for people to learn, well, you know, Aware has things going on too, or other people have things. So the fear of making a mistake, we can be really hard on ourselves about that too.
And we elevate other people. Everyone else is fine. Their lives are perfect. Their minds are beautiful, clear, crisp lakes. You know, everyone only has positive thoughts. Yeah. And of course, it's not true. People are struggling all the time.
And Keith, you know, I have the noisy thoughts too. So when I go to put my glasses on, that's because I'm checking the questions and answers. So while I'm doing that, one person asked us about depression, complicated depression related to grief. And we had a webinar on earlier in the year, specifically on the links between grief and depression. And I'd encourage that person to look at that. And the Irish Hospice Foundation have wonderful resources as well. But could you talk to that for a few moments while I just check what else is here, please?
And so I suppose recognizing that grief is this overwhelming thing that can hit us when we lose someone that we love. And it's a very normal and natural process. And we can get stuck in it as well. And often when we get stuck, we can't see a way out of it, then that maybe is when depression happens too. And there's a process through grief, which often is a little bit hard, but it is about beginning to talk or relate to the person who's passed, and how do we go on doing that. And if our grief is our own and it's just trapped in here, then that can be very overwhelming. And when our grief is shared a little bit, we share the photos, we share the stories, we share the experiences that we had with this person, and we share it among our family and friends, then that allows that emotion, which is a really natural and beautiful emotion, out a little bit. And that's where it wants to go. And Irish people often do that brilliantly when we get the idea of the wake. We come together and we share stories about the person who's passed. And that's a really healthy thing. But the wake shouldn't end the night before the funeral. It's not a one-day event. And that actually we often need to wake the person for a really long time. And, you know, in Catholic culture, you have the month's mind, that we're still thinking about the person a month later. We often have, you know, the anniversary mass, we're still thinking about the person a year later. And that these are really important things that actually just acknowledge that grief is going to keep going for a while, but not to ignore it, suppress it, try to stop it. I want to get back to normal. No, actually, I want to get to where I get to talk and reflect on this person that I really loved.
I was listening. I know I was double tasking there, but I was listening, and it makes so much sense. And I think in terms of 3 things: intensity, frequency, duration. And when we lose someone we love initially, gosh, the grief can be so intense and it can seem as if it's going to last forever. And then over a period of time, those intense moments, we don't lose them. They can come back on birthdays and anniversaries, or moments where we think we see the person or we see someone who looks like them, but they're not maybe as intense and they don't last as long, and they can spread out. And then people who are experiencing grief over really intensely, again, I know I'm repeating myself, but it's important to reach out and get support. Keith, we've really interesting questions, and there's a few related to the workplace, and there's a few related to both the workplace and GPs. When you reach out for help, and if you're not believed, or if you're seen, you said, well, we're living through a pandemic and that's normal, and basically get on with it. How would you respond to help people really, if they're not getting the right kind of help, to reach out to someone else and make sure they get it?
Well, they're great questions, because I think they're questions that lots of people are facing at the moment. So I think that there's a lots of pieces in there. One is it can be hard to get help, and it can be hard to get help in Ireland. And I think that's why charities like Aware were set up, because there was huge gaps in the support that was being offered. And so all the Aware services are there for people to reach out to, and the other services that are out there, if people can't find it through the kind of the mainstream. In terms of the pandemic, I think people are recognizing the pandemic now as a traumatic event. And there's different types of trauma, and people think of trauma and PTSD as a car crash or going to war, but there's also living through periods of terrorism or political terror or a pandemic, where you might be frightened of dying every day, or frightened of making the person you love ill by bringing home a virus. And that we can do that for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, but that nearly 2 years of that actually takes its toll on people. And so I think we're seeing a huge rise in mental health presentations, anxiety and depression and so on, because we've been living through a pandemic for so long, and that this is not a normal thing. There's nothing normal about living through this process. Same way there would be nothing normal about living through a car crash or living through a war. That actually this is really difficult, and it affects different people in different ways. And depending on people's situations, we might be very isolated, or we might be very overwhelmed. So we could be an ICU nurse who's just has too much, and there's just too much threat everywhere. We might be an older person who just feels totally isolated and alone. But in each case, this is too much. This pandemic is too much. And I think maybe services they're still using the old model of how to think about this, and maybe haven't fully recognized how serious the events that are happening are for our mental health. There's lots of resources in terms of managing through the pandemic. I'd recommend people look at the Psychological Society of Ireland homepage. There's loads of videos, handouts, workbooks and so on that might be helpful. My own is up there, free to download, Coping During COVID. If people put that into Google, that has lots of good tips for managing at this time. But it's really hard. And I think going back to the workplace has increased the stress for lots of people. It's not a back to normal, and it's not necessarily a happy event. It's actually, now I really feel in danger.
And just continuing on from what you were saying, Keith, we've talked about thoughts and we've talked about behavior, but the feeling part is also obviously a key aspect of depression. And I think sometimes if any of us were feeling wonderful and delighted and excited all the time at the moment, there'd be something wrong with us, because it is, as you described so well, is a difficult, challenging time. So it's helping us manage how we're feeling, but not making it worse by those noisy thoughts. And there's two things I'd like to throw in terms of how I help myself and other people cope with all of this. One is language. So you started off talking about people talking about they are depressed. I have a different way of thinking about that it's something that somebody might have depression, might experience depression. So it's like a bag that we're carrying, and there can be other stuff, and we mightn't be able to get rid of it, but it's not us, it's separate. So I am Claire, you are Keith, but I have moments where I feel down, or I have moments where things are really, really difficult. And then the other thing to throw in, and Jamie and Karen behind will be saying, there she goes again, but my way of summarizing the cognitive behavioral therapy is what I call the ABC coping sentence. So A, acknowledge, I feel upset, I feel down, I feel under pressure, I feel dismissed. B, because I think other people don't understand what's going on for me. Or B, because I think this is so hard. Or B, because I think everyone else has it better than I do, or whatever. So A, acknowledge, B, because, and then C is choose. So what are we going to choose to do? So I choose to breathe slowly. I choose to ask for a get and take help. I choose to be kind to myself. I choose to keep going. in whatever way. And we know part of depression, those noisy thoughts can be very frightening. So people can genuinely think they're better off dead and become frightened and think they're suicidal and worry about it. And we know they're only thoughts. And in my view, people cannot feel suicidal, they're thoughts. Excuse me. But some people act on those thoughts because they're frightened by it, particularly if they've had alcohol. So looking at what we can actually do. One of the questions was, does walking help? Well, walking is brilliant if we're enjoying it and if we're slowing down. But if we're beating ourselves up that we're not fit enough, we shouldn't have been out, and that, it's not as helpful. So that's a big long rigmarole. So Keith, we're coming up to time, would you believe? So I'm going to ask you, what are your takeaways in terms of how you help people cope with depression?
So I come back to the word kindness a lot. And that often people with depression can show great kindness to others. They have no problem bringing kindness to their friends and family, to hold kindness in their hearts towards other people. But when it comes to themselves, there's a harshness and a criticism, and that a real sense of they're not, good enough. And that actually trying to picture those other people that they love and hold that picture in their mind, and then to include themselves in that picture. That they're one of those people too. They're one of those people who deserve kindness, who deserve compassion, who deserve a little bit of leeway, a little bit of generosity. And that we're all deserving of that. And if we can hold ourselves in mind in the same way and treat ourselves in the same way as we treat other people, then that might help a little bit.
And Keith, as you move on to the next task, are you going to beat yourself up over, oh, I didn't join a Where's Call 5 minutes early or 10 minutes early, as I said I would, or are you going to be able to let that go? Because sometimes stuff like that bothers me. So if you are able to let it go, how do you do that, please?
Well, I won't let it go immediately. So it won't be magic. But I mean, a little bit, I'll talk it through. So did I try my best? I actually tried really hard to be here today. Did stuff go wrong that I didn't have a lot of control over? The stuff went wrong that I didn't have a lot of control over. And that actually not starting from the place of this is my fault, how can I blame myself? But kind of noticing, look, there's things here that worked for me and things that really worked against me. And that's what was happening. And that's okay.
Brilliant. And the one I use in the ABC coping sentence in that scenario, I feel embarrassed, I feel upset because I think I've let people down, or I think I've made a fool of myself, or whatever it is. But I choose to learn from this. And every time I use that myself, it really anchors me back in, okay, this is a learning opportunity here. So I really want to thank you. I know we haven't gone anywhere near all of the questions, so I'd encourage people to follow up aware.ie. And this is being recorded, so it'll be there as a resource, and a really important resource, Keith. So gur míle maith agat. And Friday then we'll be talking to people who have experience of depression, who are coming forward to talk about their experiences and how they cope. So unless there's anything else you want to say, Keith, we'll leave it there.
Great. Thanks very much, Claire.
Thank you.